We were talking about how novel in India participates with various existing genres in India itself, and then other ancillary and complementary supplementary discourses that were available in 19th century. Uh, when we are thinking about uh, specificities of the novel itself, the salient characteristics of the novel itself, uh, one very important thing that comes through the idea of novel in its traditional form is the idea of linearity, and it comes from the method of plotting, right? If you look at the conventional novel, it's linear. It progresses from point A to B to C to D in a temporal trajectory. Whereas once we think about the indigenous ways of telling a story, one comes across methods of circularity. If you look at something like again Kadambari, as I was telling you that that Shudraka listens to the account of the Sukha bird. The bird has listened to Maharshi Jabali, which contains the story of Mahashweta in it. Or if you think about Arabian Nights, it's again a story within a story within a story. Or, for example, the epics itself, the story of Ramayana being relayed by Lava and Kush in the court of Rama when they have been brought there, and that's how Rama identifies Lava and Kush as his sons. Or Ganesha writing the story of Mahabharata itself, you will see a certain kind of circularity that informs the Indian storytelling methods. If you factor that, that comes in direct confrontation with the linear idea of the world that is being proposed by the Western novel. So, that tension had to be resolved by the Indian novelists. And each one of them took a different route, each one of them thought of finding solutions in a innovative way. And that's why one needs to think about these certain nodes. If the first node is of linearity, that how do we think of a story in linear terms, that it will start at a certain point and it will end in a certain point with the method of plotting that is very prevalent in Victorian realist novels. And that, as we are talking about, comes in direct confrontation with the circular nature of telling stories in India. If one looks at one very experimental work in this sense will be Raja Rao's Cat and Shakespeare. If you look at it again, there Raja Rao does not adhere to any of the linear plotting methods in that sense. Brings in the Indian philosophical tradition, specifically the Marjara Nyayam, but also brings in the way of telling that tale. Another interesting example in this case would be R.K. Narayan's grandmother's tale. And it's fascinating because uh, it revives this tradition of tale telling, which again does not think so much in terms of going from one point A to point B to point C, and then creating a narrative linear like this, a linear narrative like this. So what you have instead, the grandmother trying to tell the story and constantly being intervened and being asked questions, which then again take it back, comes forth, and there is a kind of a temporal jump and back and forth that happens. We will actually come across this when we read A.K. Ramanujan's wonderful essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, where he details and tells us stories of drawn from Indian folk tale, where the fourth wall is breached, and also the story seems to come back in a circle, right? So that is one way, one productive tension that many Indian novelists faced, that how to bring the linear aspect of plotting into the Indian narrative tradition itself. The second is the idea of space and time, which is already what we have hinted at. The pre-novel forms most of the time would start with a invocation once upon a time. So you don't have specificities that are outlined. Where is this place? What is this place? And everything. Again, grandmother's tale. The grandmother actually rebukes the grandson because the grandson asks a lot of questions about which place is this, where did you go, how did you reach, in this much time you reached, how is this possible? And the grandmother gets irritated that, like, do you want to know the story or not? What is more important for you? But what we see there is a clash between the Western expectations of space and time that a reader has, that it will formulate a cohesive and a very continuous timeline, whereas the grandmother did not have any regard for that kind of an idea, because for her the more important thing was to tell the tale. It was about the people, it was about how the story shapes up, rather than remembering. What she thinks is like these are incidental details. She does not think that space and time do mark a very important part of her narrative, of her own life. So if one starts thinking, for example, the tale-telling tradition, also in Jataka tales and others, the Once Upon a Time is a very famous invocation, and it then tells us of where the time past and time present are almost absent in that sense. So, so our focus is on abstract, transcendental moral realities, rather than very contextual and particular worldviews. So, but the novel depicts, as we talked about, particulars. The novel is very tied to the idea of the particular itself. So, that again results in a productive tension, which Indian novelists had to think about, that how do we resolve this idea that, like, we have a tradition where we can think about these larger questions. We are not so much focused on talking about specificities, giving temporal and spatial locations and specific environment. So how do we do this? We cross over from the cross fertilization with a fable like or an allegorical text to novel itself. The third will be related to this, questions of particularity. If you look at pre-novelistic discourses that are available, like fable and everything, again, particularity is not something that is very much highlighted. Particularity is not something that we see too much being relied on, unlike the novel, as we are talking about, because the novel thinks of particular as a very important component of it. The particular person, as we're talking about in the names itself, or in the specificity, let's say, of the room itself, that where is the furniture placed, where is this person sitting, what exactly is he doing, what kind of clothes they are wearing, what is their visage, and the minutest of details that can be given. So, the particular is then a site of contestation. Like, what does the novelist in India do? Then, do they move towards this kind of a particularity? And many of them do. Many of them highlight that they are writing narratives which are not like that was there before. They want to write things that are lifelike. Many of them say that they are not into writing fantastical stories anymore, and which hints at the existing older methods of literary expression. Many of them mention and assert that they are into writing about lives around. The here and now constitutes their attention. As I was talking about Chandu Menon, if you read the introductory remarks, he tells you about that like, why is he doing this? Because he wants a reform there in that sense, right? If you look at Fakir Mohun Senapati's Chhaumana Athagund, 6 acres and a third, you will see that there is an impulse again of what we call social realism, that like this is what the society is, these are the different demographies that are there around, and these are how the feudal lords are exploiting the lower classes and castes, and you see a critique of the society itself, which is not that was possible in the earlier forms. So, one starts seeing a resolution that happens, but within that you also think about like questions of virtue, questions of transcendental justice, questions that complicate space and time arguments, and questions that are kind of vexing in nature in terms of particularity, the emphasis of particularity that Western novel brings in. If one sees these sticking points of linearity, space, time, and particularity that were faced by Indian novelists in general, not only the Indian English novelists, one has to also start thinking about what were the Indians reading at this point of time. And that is a very determining feature. One needs to know, for example, Chandu Menon actually adapts Benjamin Disraeli's Henrietta's Temple, a minor classic if you think in terms of it. Many of the 19th century writers are adapting what would be thought of as melodramas in 19th century that are Victorian period. You will see that they are not adapting what would have been the choices, favored choices, like someone like Dickens, someone like Thackeray, someone like Austen. You would think that they would be the models that they would go for. But somehow Indian writers, when they are presented with these complications and what they are getting from getting through colonial modernity, through education, through English education, they're obviously reading Dickens and all the other canonical writers, but somehow when it comes to writing Indian novels, they do not seem to follow them. Priya Joshi, and it's pretty seminal work about what Indians are reading in 19th century, provides us a clue here that why are Indians going for these second-rate writers of Victorian world who probably are not read anymore. What did these books provide and what did these books give them to resolve these tensions pretty well? Joshi, through an example of G.W.M. Reynolds, uh, tells us of the peculiarity of reading here. She says that Indians obviously were pushed and goaded by the government to read the canon, the canonical classical writers like Dickens, like Austen, and others. And she goes through the library catalogs and people's reading requests to posit her claims. And it's fascinating to see what comes out of it. That you see that people, Indian reading public at this point of time, not a very significant number, but what they are reading is they are reading all these canonical classical writers, but then they are also reading writers like Reynolds, writers like Disraeli, and other what will be known as melodramatic writers. And her contention here is important to us because that gives us a sense to how the 19th century writers are thinking of their society at this point of time. She says many of them are engaged in a kind of counter reading because they are not reading what their masters want them to read in that sense, right? So if you think about the ideal model being Dickens, they are not doing that. They are like, on the other hand, going to Disraeli. So she says this kind of a counter reading is a bit subversive because it does not go according to the plans of the colonizer, of the British government itself, and people are reading according to their own tastes. And what is that taste? They are reading melodramas. Why? Because according to her, the melodramas offer something very important to the Indians at this point of time. Indians, and this ties in with Meenakshi Mukherjee's argument about the popularity of Pilgrim's Progress, that Indians at this point of time love to read some didactic treatises. Accounts, narratives, and the popularity of Pilgrim's Progress and its translations across languages verifies to it. Priya Joshi says the melodramas tap into that impulse. Because in melodrama, Joshi would argue that unlike the classic realist novel, the melodramas clearly earmark the good and the evil and then stage the victory of one over the other. So there is clear moral outlines that are drawn. And she says Indians found that to their own benefit. For someone like Chandu Menon, who would be writing a treatise aimed at reform, or someone like Bankim who is struggling with the modern world, being a child of modernity, neither can be part of the whole colonial modernity wholeheartedly, but ill at ease with his own conventional orthodox society. They need their audience and themselves to find a kind of a moral synthesis or a closure. And that was provided by the melodramas. So, in a way, the melodramas fit right into what the Indians were looking for. The other part, extending the argument, is a push towards politics. So, if you have clear moral outlines given, and she reads Reynolds, one of Reynolds' books, to give us a sense that how these positions which are on the ends of the spectrum offer a political reality and a push towards activism, which is what 19th century India needed. So, what Indians are reading at this point of time also is geared towards not only reformist tendencies but also nationalistic impulse, as we were talking about in the last class. So, therefore, what we get to see in the early Indian writers writing in writing novel is something very radical, something very fascinating, because in terms of reading habit, it's a subversive reading habit. In terms of co-option of the novel, they have to juggle and negotiate with various competing and complementary discourses. They also have to contend with foundational notions like linearity, space, time, and particularity, and they find the Western melodrama to be an ally in this pursuit. This offers us a very rich and a layered account of the coming of novel to India. Therefore, unlike what initial scholarship on Indian writing in English believed, that this was the Western idea that novel was a Western product and this was the Indian response, it is far more than that. One would be mistaken to just think of it as a derivative of the Western novel itself, because it emerges out of various contributing factors which are very complex at this point of time. We'll stop here today and we'll look at Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Rajmohan's wife in the next class. Thank you.